A new exhibit at the National Museum of African American History at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. highlights the experience of African Americans during World War I. And here to tell us more about it is ER doctor and National Geographic photographer Dr. Jeff Gusky. Thanks so much for joining us
this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. So what happened is that I stumbled onto the only trace of a black combat unit that still exists today and got a meeting with the chief curator of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Before they opened the doors of the new museum, it was like an emergency meeting because I'd stumbled on to the only modern trace of this story they were working on, which would become this exhibit. And he says halfway through the meeting, it was Dr. Rex Ellis, you stumbled onto I Have a Dream before I Have a Dream.
Wow.
And then he said it again. And so it turns out that this is almost, it's the stuff of legend. It's almost mystical because this wasn't just any black unit. This was the only all African American unit in the entire US military. But what makes it more amazing is that 101 years ago, when they fought so patriotically for America, they were already 49 years old. So what it turns out to be is that the founders of this unit were African American Union soldiers from the land of Lincoln, who became the torchbearers of Abraham Lincoln's vision of freedom for all of us just after the Civil War, and form an all-volunteer, all-black militia. And it becomes the epicenter of a community of freedom. They lived the dream of Martin Luther King long before he's born.
And the group is called the
Black Devils. That's what the Germans called them because of their fierceness in combat. So there's so many firsts, but just to give you an example, these are American visionaries, not victims. And so on the last day, the last hour, the last minute of World War I, the last Americans fighting are the Black Devils, the only all African American unit in the entire US military, led by the highest ranking black officer in the military, whose grandfather is a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln and a pallbearer at his funeral.
Wow.
When everyone else quit, they kept fighting and pursued a German convoy, fleeing them in fear all the way across the Belgian border, captured them, and then they quit.
And you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but how is the story healing right now?
Well, it takes us back to the core problem of modern racism. So it was the way they saw themselves. You know, when Martin Luther King ends his I Have a Dream speech, he talks about free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty we're free at last. They never saw themselves as subhuman or second-class citizens. They were patriotic Americans who saw themselves as fully human and fully American. And it shows us where the problem lies. So it's like, as a doctor, it's like there's a 125-year-old abscess that is causing us pain, and we don't know it's there. And what happened, I believe, is that and it comes from my experience with the Holocaust. I was the first fine art photographer to go behind the Iron Curtain after the wall fell and to document a hidden world of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, when you go back in time, it was born on the streets of Paris just after the birth of mass media, with a very evil formula, using media, that is myth amplified by media to incite rage in crowds for power. People don't realize it came here less than a year later in a conspiracy to overturn the Civil War. And it was propagating the myth that there's something wrong with African Americans. It's total fake news. There was never anything wrong with African Americans. It was never the way they saw themselves. Here's the problem. This cabal, funded by wealthy oligarchs from up north, propagated this myth through the face of Booker T. Washington. So the leading African American spokesperson of the day was convincing millions of white Americans that there was something wrong with African Americans. And he used that white money to buy up controlling interest in black media. So no one knew what was going on until 8 years later, when a courageous young man named William Monroe Trotter, the first African American Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard, graduates in the top 1% of his class in 1895, goes to jail for 30 days for pushing back against Booker T. Washington. Modern civil rights movement was born by African American visionaries pushing back against this technique of dehumanizing large segments of society using myth amplified by media to incite rage and crowds for power.
And now we have, this entire exhibit people can go check out at the African American Museum. And we want to thank you, Dr. Gusky,
it's an honor
so
to be
much
here.
for joining us
Thank you.
today. Again, you can check out that exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History through mid-June, and we have a ton more information on that on our website, fox43.com.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us, and Fox 43 Morning News at 9. We'll be right back.